Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this webinar held by Ksapa.org, organization driving human rights, climate, inclusive growth agenda. We're delighted to welcome you all for that discussion today. And we are going just to start the conversation, ensuring that a few technical points are shared with you all to maximize your time and value taking part in this discussion with us today. So, of course, you can change your name. Be aware that you're automatically muted. That maximizes quality of sound for everyone. We don't use cameras, including for our speakers. Myself, I'll introduce myself in a minute. If you want, you can invite other participants. And most importantly, being a socially responsible organization, we minimize energy consumption of those discussions, so they're uploaded in a way that is of low energy consumptions. There will be a short poll at the end that will be activated. Please provide responses, just 3 questions. It's helpful for us to maximize value of upcoming webinars. Last and not least, you're close to 200 plus participants registered to this webinar, so you can access the list of registered participants that we can share after the webinar. And this conversation is recorded, so you can make sure that if you want to broadcast or share the content or access the presentation that is going to follow during the webinar today, this is going to be accessible open source as part of the open source contents available on Ksapa.org website in just a few days from today. We are in conversation today to explore how to use effective human rights due diligence and streamline compliance efforts. A reason why we're including these webinars are part of a long series of webinars that has been driving a lot of discussions with multiple stakeholders for the past 3 years is because overall we know that there are a growing number of yourself as part of our audience really scratching your heads, exploring how to be effective to combine due diligence on human rights, that is a sensitive and complex topic, and at the same time having to navigate multiple geographies and multiple compliance efforts that are requested increasingly. Therefore, I introduce myself as the moderator of the session today. On behalf of our team at Ksapa, I'm Farid Badash. I combine corporate, academia, and geo experience, working for more than 20 years on human rights and combining conceptual, practical experience on the topic. Really, having worked globally across the globe, and I'm delighted to lead that conversation on behalf of our large community at Ksapa, including our team and affiliate network based across every geographies in North, South America, Africa, Europe, and Southeast Asia. We're a mission-driven organization, and we've worked a lot with financial institutions and large companies and their supply chain on human rights to conduct due diligence, have practical guidance, ensuring that they can mitigate risks on those topics. We also love, and we find it extremely important to connect the dots between human rights and environmental agenda as part of our how we work on those issues. Our approach try to be as action-oriented as possible. So we approach the concept of due diligence with a lot of agility, meaning that for us, being capable to adapt due diligence to a different context is important. Middle East is a context with regulatory local environment that is different from what you can find, for example, in Latin American markets. So we try to adapt to that scale. We explore cost-effective approaches, ensuring that scalability of due diligence can be applicable across assets under management when we work with financial institutions and operations when we work with large companies. And obviously, most important aspect, right holder perspective is something we factor, knowing that the topics we're addressing when it comes to human rights are extremely sensitive. So that really calls for being extremely creative, ensuring that exploring concrete risk mitigative measure on human rights take the lens and the perspective of right holders, and particularly vulnerable right holders, poor, low educated workers, gender when relevant, communities, farmers, and others. Hence the development, that's I think a unique value proposition of how our community operates. We really try to be solution oriented, and we deploy risk mitigative solutions, including capacity building programs at large scale with digital solutions, financial engineering that support the system and ensure the self-funding of those scalable programs, ensuring that supply chains or large operations or financial institutions can deploy risk mitigative measure, walking the talk of due diligence and ensuring compliance with effective impact measurement of how they are genuinely capable to mitigate human rights risk across operations and markets. When it comes to human rights due diligence date, I will just make a brief introduction to say that we are facing a topic that has gained a lot of momentum. Myself, I've been in the space for more than 20 years, and I've seen between 2002 and 2022 how beyond regulatory pressures, for example, financial pressures, and how investors have started to explore how to better understand human rights across assets under management has become more important in their agenda through engagement, through commitments, and through, for example, OECD National Contact Point discussions. There's clearly here today a momentum that we didn't have a couple of years ago. We tried to provide an overview of some of the prominent human rights regulatory initiatives that have come across a variety of markets. We believe are shaping from financial institutions as much as from large company and buyer perspective, growing, converging agenda, long story short, calling for duty of vigilance. Although, as you can see across the multiple initiatives here, what is very interesting is that they are coming with different priority top of mind. So that means that if you really want to conduct a due diligence, and actually at the end of the day, the California Human Trafficking Initiative is primarily focused on human trafficking. Or if you look at the Dutch Child Labor Due Diligence Act, that is fundamentally calling for effective mapping of potential child labor risks across the supply chain, and documented risk mitigative measure proving effectiveness of how to mitigate risks of potential occurrence of child labor. You can see that you have two topics that may talk to each other, human trafficking on the one hand, child labor on the other hand, but not necessarily perfectly well. They may not match, or they may actually even diverge. Hence the question of having that combination of patchwork of regulatory initiatives, more or less converging, supporting a broad human rights agenda, but more or less diverging, calling for documented compliance on topics, scopes of business that may vary significantly. The bottom left corner, you can see that France's duty of vigilance is something that is has a very broad scope. For example, it's a broad human rights supply chain scope, whereas, for example, the recent US Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is focused on an issue, on a community, on a geography. And so you, as a company or a decision maker, you can navigate between those two slightly conflictual requirements. Closing, and as part of our conversation today, many of you taking part in the webinar today are just scratching their head to understand one of the latest and newcomer in the space, the Norway Transparency Act. And Eric, taking part of the call today, will share an overview of the Norway Transparency Act to understand actually what is specific or common with this additional or one more regulatory initiative. An additional stakeholder that is extremely active, that has been active particularly for the past 3-5 years, has been the European Union, ruling on behalf of European markets. And for everyone taking part in the webinar today, this needs to be very, very carefully understood, because the EU initiatives in the space of human rights overall address first and foremost, obviously, operations headquartered or located or under regulatory compliance of countries headquartered within the 26 European countries first, but also, and that's clearly part of the scope, the supply chain and the companies or financial institutions doing business with the European Union, meaning that at the end of the day, there is a kind of iterative process that intend to embrace virtually a lot of business financial institution that can be headquartered really everywhere, including the US, Southeast Asia. So this is really important. And what the European Union is providing, there is a combination of multiple framework, one that is financial framework that is fundamentally the Green Deal that is through taxonomy in SFRD, increasingly calling to ensure that financial institutions and investors invest more to support green transition, but this needs to be conducted in a way which do no significant harm. So there we go. There we connect the dot between a political impetus supporting and encouraging a green energy transition to ensure that fundamentally European economy becomes more adapted to a climate constraint world on the one end, but this must happen in a way that must proactively embrace the OECD guideline and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights to prove that those investments are made in a way that is respectful from a business perspective on human rights. But the actually additional more business specific directives underway, one that is expected to enter into enforcement starting 2024, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CS3D, which expands the scope of due diligence and risk mitigative measure beyond a core scope of human rights and needs to be in correlation with an environmentally friendly approach. For example, you cannot claim to respect human rights if operations or assets under management are not respecting a Paris Agreement 1.5 climate trajectory. So that connection is interesting because there's been a lot of debate around it that goes beyond supply chain, knowing that many of the regulatory framework focus on supply chain, which by itself has actually already its complexity, but the EU CS3D is calling for a broader scope, including consumer-facing and business partners activities. And that connects with more specific initiatives, for example, one that builds or then might correlate with the Uyghur, the US Uyghur initiative, but try to disconnect from the political agenda of the Uyghur movement to connect with a broader statement on forced labor and ensure that anything that might characterize forced labor may not be imported in the EU market. That's a directive, and an additional or other directive underway of enforcement on zero deforestation is actually also calling for zero deforestation that has a traceability that is attached to a due diligence on human rights. So long story short, this has its own and complex agenda. Two blog articles related to Ksapa website are accessible to understand the EU directive on the one end and navigate the difference with all those jargonic, technical CSRD, SFRD, and FRD, and other EU technical requirements. It's a briefing paper, so you can look at those documents to have more information. At the end of the day, what makes a robust due diligence process underway and that might ensure compliance afterward is first and foremost to ensure that given the scope to address the variety of regulatory initiatives at stake, the best approach is to ensure, and that's actually how we strongly promote and work actively with our ecosystem of stakeholders, clients, and partners, that there are 5 areas that have to be covered one way or another. The systemic perspective is a good way to ensure that there is an holistic understanding of the human right that can potentially be at stake. That ensure that you connect the dot between modern slavery, child labor, and other regulatory initiatives and understand, first and foremost, the scope of human rights that are potentially at scope once for all. 2, and that's always something that is very difficult for many organizations, action plan must demonstrate reasonable efforts to ensure compliance, yes, but they actually also must demonstrate continuous improvement. We don't claim that everything can be solved, but we must prove through point number 2 that action plan address issues first and 2 are capable to demonstrate over time that there is improvement and impact. We don't care with those approaches to know how much money is spent on due diligence. We care about how much impact is generated from those efforts. And that's different because sometimes there are ways to be smart and actually spend less with more effectiveness. Point number 3 is on right holder perspective. Again, it's an aspect across those due diligence effort that is very important. And I would turn this aspect to many of you taking part in the call today. How often we are scratching our head from far away from the field or from the worker perspective, saying, I don't think that that's with my OKR, but actually if we can't prove it, if there is no direct captor taking the perspective of a worker, of whatever can frame a vulnerable segment of the population, low educated segment, low income people, gender, communities that are marginalized in the territory, whatever might frame a right holder and vulnerable segment into it, actually, we don't know what we're talking about. So being capable to factor that perspective directly or indirectly, and we need to be creative about how we capture that perspective is very important. Point number 4 is about grievance mechanism. It's really anchored in the UN guiding principles. And this is overall something that might look very simple and basic, ensure that people can flag issues. But that topic in terms of how people are aware, feel comfortable to use, whatever might be discovered through a grievance mechanism can generate corrective measure, improving the impact on them on point number 2. All those aspects need to be closely scrutinized. And this is how a due diligence is conducive of more effective mitigative approach on human rights. Last point, transparency. All those efforts must be disclosed and shared. I think we all know that financial organizations making investment, business organizations, no matter where they operate in the world, cannot monitor and control everything. It is on the safer side to be transparent about a good understanding of the risks, a good degree of sharing on what is done with what success, to engage stakeholders on how to improve instead of just trying to close the door and just basically pretend to manage issues. I think it's not on the good safer side to operate like that. And this is clearly something that is increasingly demanded by all of those regulatory frameworks. So I'm going to close on this initial perspective to make sure that we connect with actually the perspective of our great contributors today. There are a lot of concrete guidance that is accessible open source on our website. These are just sample examples of briefing papers accessible to get deeper on many of the methodology or topics that are supported for greater due diligence and your understanding of how to embrace the human rights agenda. These top challenges will frame the conversations going forward. How to connect through the 5 major shockholds, local regulatory framework, and let's focus on the Norway's Transparency Act for a minute to understand what's specific or common with this initiative. And we currently have even some clients in the US asking for how to comply with Norwegian Transparency Act. So it's really top of mind for many decision makers that are taking part in the conversation today. An interesting topic maybe to connect the environmental, the business, and the human rights considerations, how to be cost effective in the approach. And as we are going to talk extensively about ASEAN and Pacific Asian operations, where every company, every asset owner has skin in the game, how to connect those conceptual and regulatory compliance with the actual operations, for example, with focus on some Asian markets. So let's look at that briefly. And for our conversation, I will make sure that first and foremost, our close contributor today, Eric, can take part in the conversation. So we can have an initial focus on Eric and the approach, how to approach the Norwegian Transparency Act. Eric, welcome.
Thank you very much, Farid, and thank you for inviting me to speak to this audience about the Norwegian Transparency Act that came into effect from this summer. I have been working most of my career in telecommunications. Currently, I focus on the construction and building industries in Norway with support in health and safety issues. And the team of consultants I work with, we have based our business on 2 pillars. That's health and safety before and after accidents. So in the before accidents, we do internal training, we do risk assessments, and one-to-one consulting. And in the after accidents perspective, we do investigations into accidents or incidents with large loss potential. So how does this then relate to the Transparency Act? I think this is fascinating, and if you can move me to the next slide, please, Farid. The Act came into force from July. There was a fair amount of media focus on this over the summer. But if you look at the adaptation rate in the industry, I think the response is rather slow. Even though the number of companies in scope is rather large, we talk about roughly 9,000 local companies that are in scope of the requirements, including all companies with an annual revenue of more than 7 million euros. So you don't have to be very large in order to be in scope for the Transparency Act. The Act is basing its logics on the OECD guidelines for multinational companies and the recommendations for due diligence. And companies are expected to assess not only their processes and operations, but also their supply chains. And that's probably the most important new addition to business behavior in this country. Because up until now, legislation has been reasonably good when it comes to your operations, including a General Application Act, meaning that you are required to ensure that collective agreements valid in this country is also applied to workers that are contracted to your operations. Now you have been asked to expand this into supply chains, and that's where the challenges start. But I think we could put this reasonably easy, Farid, to say that if a company follows the Ksapa's 5 core principles, they would be well on the way to meet the requirements of the Transparency Act. It focuses mainly on human rights and labor rights, decent working conditions, and up until now, the focus of the Act does not include climate change and environmental factors, neither the origin of raw materials. Could you move me to the next slide, please?
There you go.
Thank you very much. I think for a business that's in the scope of the Transparency Act, it's easy. You go through a 4 or 5 step approach. You assign responsibility to someone in the management team. You make sure that your practices are linked to your management system. You assess current practices and identify risks and how you map this with the legal requirements. Make sure to identify partners to cooperate with, because the easiest approach is not to do this on your own, but together with other companies in the same situation. And you must also make sure that you allocate the resources to do this, because in a medium-sized company, you would spend not only human resources, but also financial resources in order to identify the risks and make sure that you have mitigations in place. Another requirement of the Transparency Act is to make sure that you make information available to the public, and you are also requested to do an annual reporting of your approach and the steps you take. And the best way to do this is to align this with your annual reporting according to the Norwegian Accounting Act. And the deadline for most companies in this country would be June 2023. So with a new act coming into place in the summer and a reporting deadline 11 months into the future, I think that's a fair explanation to why responses in the business community have been rather slow. I've been talking to a few companies, and we see a range here from companies not understanding the questions to some very mature companies saying that yes, we focus on this and this is going to require resources for a long time, and I don't think we can be compliant to these requirements in less than 5 years. So this is a statement from an owner and CEO of a company that states that they are clearly in the lead and want to stay there. So that's the way they see the challenge. If you compare this to analysis that have been done locally on the understanding and respect for the OECD guidelines, we have seen that only a small percentage of Norwegian businesses fully understand the requirements of OECD guidelines, and less than 50% of companies that are in scope for those guidelines are actually familiar with the guidelines at a high level. So I don't think we can expect radical changes in the near future. I think there is a milestone towards the summer of 2023 where we will see what proportion of companies are actually including the reporting of transparency into their annual reports, normally combined with the sustainability reporting, which is also required by the law. But I think we need a longer time perspective to see changes. And if you look into the construction and building industries in this country, I think the status is, I wouldn't say depressing, but the situation could have been a lot better. If you look at this industry, we see that we report more than 10 fatalities each year, comparing to the oil and gas industry, where the number is 0. So in the construction and building industries, we have a long way to go when it comes to not only labor conditions, but also human rights perspective. There is a large proportion of import labor. And when I visit companies, I see that it's not uncommon that import labor still suffers. And that's a situation we should not see here at all. So I welcome the Transparency Act, but at the same time, it will take years in order to make sure that businesses are compliant to the requirements.
But in a way, and I move actually also maybe to your closing slide, it shows a certain degree of maturity to have decision makers understanding the complexity of what's at stake and saying, you know, we need 5 years to expect to fulfill what's expected, because there are other business decision makers. And I've seen some of those saying, well, there is nothing new is what this document is all about. And at the end of the day, we are actually already compliant, meaning that they really don't understand what they're talking about and what's at stake. So that's...
But in 2 years' time, the EU legislation in this area will be updated, and that may also affect and require updates in the Norwegian Transparency Act. So there will be a development here, not only improvement for businesses, but also new requirements from the legislators. And I think if you take a serious approach to this, identify risks in your main processes, deal with those risks, and then take this to the next level, looking into secondary processes, I think that's the best approach. We must understand that the academic approaches to these issues are not always the best approach. I'm more interested in looking for practical solutions to these issues.
Thank you. We'll come back with a few questions in a minute. I want to make sure to introduce actually as well Thomas for a perspective changing the angle and getting to the ASEAN context. Thomas, thank you for joining us fairly late.
Thank you very much.
Singapore time.
Oh, it's okay. It's only 11:30 in the night, so.
So for everyone in the audience, we'll make sure to close on time. No worries. So, well, please introduce yourself briefly and initiative, and let's talk a bit about how to anchor human rights in the ASEAN context.
Thank you, Farid, and good afternoon and good evening and good morning to all of you from all the other parts of the world. I'll start off by just introducing a little bit of the ASEAN CSR network, and I think it's important to give you a context of Southeast Asia before I plunge into the discussion on human rights in the region. Firstly, my organization is the ASEAN CSR Network. We are an ASEAN entity. We were formed, we established on the 8th of December 2010 with the objective to promote responsible business conduct in ASEAN. So we are supposed to help work with businesses to promote sustainable socio-economic development. So we are an entity within ASEAN Constitution, but ASEAN has also got a business advisory council. We are with them as well. And so that's us trying to do responsible business. But I also want to tell you a little bit of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. There are differences and similarities between EU and ASEAN. Both are regional organizations. While the EU is a community, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is an association. We don't have legislation that covers the whole region. And this whole region is very diverse. We have, in terms of geography, we have Indonesia, about 1.9 million square kilometers, covering 3 time zones, to Singapore, which is about 720 square kilometers at low tide, and with population about 270 million in Indonesia to 450,000 in Brunei. So we have huge diversity, as well as if you look at per capita income, Singapore has nearly 60,000 US dollars per capita per year, or Brunei with 26,000. But at the other extreme, you got Myanmar, which is only 1,200, or Laos with 1,300. So I'm just saying that the deviation, diversity is so great. But yet, politically, they are also very different. We have military governments, one-party states. We have absolute monarchs. We have quasi-democracies. You name it, we have it. So within this whole thing, yet there have been fantastic economic and social development. For the last 50 years, there has been peace and progress. But before that, there used to be wars and conflicts between the 10 countries. For the last many years, there's peace. And this has resulted in the doubling of GDP over the last decade. living standards has gone up. You talk about the size of the economy. The association is a country. We are the third largest in Asia and the sixth largest in the world. But how did we achieve this? All this was achieved with a mindset called growth at all costs. So just get the profits up, get the things up, whatever. So there is always a spillover effect. And part of it, if you look at our region, we have huge problems with inequalities, with corruption, social problems like forced labor, land grabs, environmental degradation, deforestations, the loss of rights, the rights of voice is gone. Might is right. And like somebody says, the strong do what they want and the weak suffer they must. So we have. But yet, within ASEAN, if you read the ASEAN forward of the ASEAN community blueprint and other vision, they will say we resolve to realize, they call it rule-based, people-oriented, people-centered ASEAN community, where our people enjoy human rights, fundamental freedoms, high quality of life, benefits of community building, reinforcing our sense of togetherness and other things. So you find that words are very strong, and they have made some progress. For example, ASEAN has two human rights organizations. One is the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. The other one is ASEAN Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Women and Children. So then my own organization was promoted to promote responsible business in ASEAN. We have a Human Rights Declaration, 2011, which is internationally acceptable standards, except in some places they have a comma and a provision clause that takes as national situation allows. So you have an state clause on it. So within the next thing I also want to say is that within ASEAN, going forward, I told you we have this position. But if you look at my own organization, we did, together with the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, we did a baseline study on the situation of CSR and human rights, because many of our countries, even if you put human rights first, it's very hard. So responsible business and human rights, business and human rights. And we found that all the countries had good declaration, good things, but implementation was a problem. In 2016, both the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights and us, we came out with a regional strategy to implement business and human rights in the region. It has not been rejected because ASEAN works on the policy of consensus. Everybody agree, or at least minimally nobody says no. So nobody has said no, but due to a lot of factors, it has not. So we did annual conferences, but things on that is not moving. On paper, somebody else is doing it, but not so much. It's not on the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights agenda. It's not. There are some countries that are just working on national action plans. And in fact, in 2019, we did a study on business and human rights in ASEAN. And the conclusion was that the standards are substantively short of the benchmark set by UNGP. So if you look at all, just looking at disclosure is low. But then if you look at disclosure for sustainability reports, the least reported issues are labor standards, labor relations, human rights, product stewardship, or climate change impacts. So the most people report on is economic performance, economic returns, how much profits, what they're doing. So you can find that what are we doing, what are the achievements. So basically, what is the approach we're doing? There are a lot of people coming in and working on it, and a lot of money and effort is spent. But really on the ground, we found with businesses, the awareness is not there. It's not different. And secondly, is even the awareness is that people hope it will never be implemented, because many of us in Asia has been under colonial powers. And many of our ex-colonial masters, they're profit-driven. So if it is for political purposes or for to make most money, the cost, they think they'll get away with it. A lot of businesses. So the question of implementation, the willpower, the political, so there's lack of awareness, and there's also a lack of capacity to do it, and drivers. And we also get mixed signals. If you go and talk to the companies, you find they'll tell you that one part of a buyer from Europe will talk about sustainability, procurement, then the procurement guy will just come and talk about cost. So the incentives to do this is not very strong. So what we have done is we have worked with the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, because before that we used to work with Global Compact Nexus, Chambers of Commerce, and things, there was a mixed result. So now we're working with them, trying to form a working group to push. We hope basically to raise awareness, to tell them, look here, there are pressures for legislation that's coming, which people will say, if I can't sell to Europe, I'll sell to China or India. I mean, you hear that very often. And also build up local networks to raise awareness, build capacity. So we are working on a principle, not just on human rights, that you need to create the whole environment on responsible business conduct. Responsible business conduct is a cross-cutting thing, which has people, which have got labor standards, which has got working also on things for the environment. The idea of, we just did a study on sustainable consumption and production, and see how we can work on resource efficiency. Those are the things that are more. So there's also in Southeast Asia, you find there's a lot of talk on sustainability. There's a lot of discussion on ESG, but mostly E, not so much on S or G. So where are we going from here? We are, I told you we are working with the ASEAN Business Advisory Council together to get companies to join up, to subscribe to a code. We developed this code called the code with the ASEAN. It's a code for responsible, inclusive business. And we talk about businesses working on principles. The principles of accountability, transparency, ethical behavior, respect for stakeholder interest, respect for rule of law, respect for international norms of behavior, and to treat people with respect, dignity, and fairness. We also cover subject areas. It's on governance, environment, labor, human rights, consumer protection, community engagement, and development. This is one of the few codes for responsible, which is accepted across the board in all the 10 countries. So we have got some standard to work with. So we are creating an organization called the ASEAN Responsible Inclusive Business Alliance to push this code and to work on it. So when I talk about all the efforts, is to build up these networks. If I think it'd be great if European companies or your companies with your supply chain in Southeast Asia work with us, join us, and help these companies, your own supply chain, but work to arrive at this. And whether we should have standards, what sort of standards we do, should we have ISO standards, other standards, and we can talk about really uplifting things, moving away the ignorance, and also moving away the building capacity. So raising awareness, building capacity, and getting everybody to mainstream it. And that will also require continuous effort, mindset change. And I think I'm quite glad to know that we are not the only ones. There are also problems in developed world as well. But in Southeast Asia, we're really working on this. I will stop now.
No, that's very interesting. And I want to make sure to convene Eric as well, because as something in common and a question coming my way to start having a joint discussion all together is this question of ignorance and capacity. Eric, you mentioned that you were surprised in a way to see the difference in performance between, for example, the oil industry and the construction industry. So at the end of the day, what's missing in terms of capacity, what could be effective to ensure alignment in what's expected and improvement of capacity. for decision maker or those responsible for improving quickly working conditions, safety, performance, for example, of imported labor workers. But the very same question applies to you, Thomas, because you mentioned across your presentation insufficient capacity, ignorance, and same. I mean, despite the variety or the diversity of markets and people and environments at stake, but maybe the top 1, 2, 3, I don't know, concrete guidance or suggestion you can share with our audience in terms of fast improvement of access to capacity or informed opinion about what's at stake and good solution, what's not acceptable. So maybe, Eric, you want to go first in terms of being effective to quickly bring up to speed decision maker. We need to know what's expected from them.
Well,
human rights.
it's a very good question, Farid, and I don't think there is a simple answer, but if you compare the oil and gas industry to the land-based construction and building industries, I believe that the drive for improvement must come from inside. And I don't think the legislators can do more than they have done from the legislative side, but maybe from the monitoring and inspection side, there is potential for improvement. But at the end of the day, the drive for improvement must come from the inside. And I'd like to make one easy comparison, and that's related to the number of road traffic fatalities annually. Many countries have a zero vision for road fatalities, but when you look into the real statistics, it's more or less impossible to control and improve if you don't make sure that the drivers and the people who move on the roads make changes to their attitudes and to their behaviors. And that's where the solution lies. We must change behaviors.
If I could add in, Farid?
Very welcome.
If you go and ask an average company in Southeast Asia why you don't do that, they will tell you the government didn't tell me to do it. I don't know what to do. I have no time, I have no money. I mean, that sort of answer. So if you ask me what's the legislation, what is their response? I think first is rules, legislation. The government has some way to say, this is what I need. This is what I expect of you. And legislation alone doesn't work. It has to be enforced. In our part of the world and many other parts in the world, a lot of rules are there, a lot of laws are there, but it's never enforced because of corruption and a whole lot of other things. And if you look at the other point that I think is also education and capacity. Even in my country, look at the oil and gas and the construction industry. The construction industry has a lot of fatalities. Oil and gas is much more safer. And it was never that. The oil and gas was also about 30, 40 years ago, had a lot of accidents. But governments passed legislation, required safety committees, safety management systems, safety. But the construction industry here has high fatality. It's mostly migrant workers. There's also a feeling that in many parts of our Southeast Asia, migrant workers are not treated as equally or as good as regular as their citizens, because migrants don't vote. So the issues of forced labor. And the other point is this: if you get these oil and gas, it's better safety standards because they're unionized. The workers have a voice. And many of the other places with migrant workers and with casual workers and non-formal workers, I think without unions, they also make. So maybe it's governments, but also internally, where workers has a voice, has the rights to do it. So if I could add another point, if you look at many of these stories about ESGs, I understand. They will talk about the environment, they talk about social. The social is basically about diversity, about health, safety, but diversity is about gender, even LGBT rights. My part of the world is a bit more sensitive, but people don't talk very much about rights, the right to organize, the right to collective bargaining, these things. So these are some of the issues that we face as well.
Another question then is how to improve. I mean, what would be, and that's another question coming our way. What could be an effective, try to translate the discussion because it's a very long text, sorry. How to improve dialogue between private sector and governments to support conducive framework. When you say, for example, Thomas, I don't do anything because my government is not asking me to do it, or to work on it. So that's clearly, I think, addressing that comment you made. But Eric, also, I think you say a bit earlier that, for example, even in Norway, there are ahead of the Transparency Act, good norms in Norway. So at the end of the day, there are good norms, but the Transparency Act is in asking new questions, and companies say, well, fine, we can work on it, but that will take time. So at the end of the day, if I try to combine the two perspectives here, the question I have for both of you is what's missing in the public-private discussion to accelerate alignment for effective action? More union, Thomas?
I would basically say that let's put the context of this dialogue. In many of the developing countries, they want to improve the lives of people by having investments. So they'll create jobs, they will create incomes, they will create wealth. So in order to attract these investments to these countries, the governments give these companies special rights, less taxation, maybe even waivers on provisions of their environmental or social rights, even the right to unionize, make it very difficult. So the dialogue between government and business in many countries is not what the country needs, but what businesses need to stay on in the country. So the pressure must, and I think the EU legislations, etc., makes it effective, because for businesses to stay on it, and they have to do due diligence on human rights, environmental impact of their business, etc. So the dialogue hopefully will be that. But a lot of governments in our own dialogue with a lot of governments, they don't know what is happening, and they depend on business and other people. And you also see in my part of the world, civil society is quite suppressed, so you don't get things. And it's also made worse because there are huge international NGOs that comes in with huge funds, but I'm not sure it has built local capacity, because eventually you're going to have real movement, real changes to build capacity of local people, local enterprises, and local, even civil society organizations to speak up and to express their views. I think that's one point that can do more.
I think, Thomas, you also at a point here mentioned the role of the unions, and I'm convinced that the unions will have to take a stronger role in the changes. But how can you expect that if you are in a country where unions are not recognized or not completely allowed? So that's another challenge here. And hope I'm not derailing the discussion, but I also like to ask for the voice of the consumer. We haven't mentioned that in today's discussions. We have pointed at lawmakers and business leaders, but at the end of the day, the voice of the consumer is also important here. When they start demanding more transparency, better practices, and fair wages through the whole chain of supplies, that will also have some effect and make sure that changes happen. What do you think, Thomas?
I agree with you completely. Last week I was attending a EU switch issue on sustainable consumption and production. We need informed consumers. A lot of time consumers are not well informed. And even in my part of the world, products labeling is not there. So if you have human rights due diligence, and one of the oldest international standards is the ILO's Fundamental Principles and Rights of Work, where all companies are expected to comply with the core conventions of the ILO, and countries were checked on it, even if they don't rectify the convention. So technically it means all MNCs, regardless of where they operate, they have to report on it. I'm not sure how many countries, how many companies actually report on it or even adhere to core conventions. Similarly, in consumer protection, I completely agree with you. And we have put in our core conventions standard on the importance of consumer rights and consumer protection. I'm on the same page. But the consumers can only be effective if they are informed. And we need to raise because today a lot of consumers go for the cheapest product, not necessarily for the most responsible and most environmentally friendly products.
This is a very interesting and important point, because there are many ways to build the business case for greater human rights enforcement. We're getting to the end of the hour, so I want to flag to people taking part in the call to please respond to the 3 questions. There is a feedback survey that is ongoing right now. Your responses are very helpful. But getting back to the point you made, both of you, Eric and Thomas, on the consumer perspective, maybe we could close the conversation saying that for a business case, no matter what companies, governments think about human rights, the more there is market demand for better social environmental performance ingrained in products, sort of, or in production, the more at the end of the day, it's not about having an ethical or political discussion, but fundamentally addressing compliance and what's expected from the market. So it's kind of a way to kind of cut or avoid long discussions to get to concrete action. I will just close the conversation with a closing word from each of you, Thomas and Eric. And just before you share a closing word, and I would have just a closing question, one takeaway from our conversation today. I will just walk through 2 complementary slides closing the discussion. People in the call are welcome to join a collaborative initiative on forced labor underway, where we are producing technical guidance with focus on electrical vehicle and solar panel to design and engage investors, buyers, and suppliers on technical requirements mitigating forced labor risks across supply chain, no matter the geography. If you want to know more, you just need to use contact@ksapa.org to inquire for more information. And if you want to stay appraised of our discussion and even get to know when the content will be uploaded, just join 4,000 plus decision makers across the globe, registering to our newsletter and getting a chance every month to get an update on what's going on with our community. As we are closing the webinar right on time, I will just close with final comment from Eric, then Thomas, on one takeaway from the conversation today, and we close the webinar today from there. Eric, one takeaway from our conversation today?
Yeah, I think the most important takeaway is all the open source material available through your web pages. I think that will put companies in a position to solve these challenges with internal resources, rather than paying large sums of money to legal experts or consulting firms in order to to help them out of the situation. I'm not trying to damage your business model, Farid, but
Not at all.
I think the best way to deal with the challenges is to try to attack them with your own internal resources.
Thomas, closing remark.
I agree with Rick. I just want to add that I think the challenge is quite great. I think we need to pull together, work together to do resources. Sadly, in my part of the world, a lot of people compete among ourselves because for various reasons. But I think if we can get people to work together, and the market is so big for everyone, there is enough for it. If we can raise awareness, and then the consultants and even civil society can go in and help people, there is a lot of need needed. So on that basis, but we still have to be very clear and be very firm on the expectations of what is really we need from business on and human rights. What does UNGPs mean, and living up to that? That I think should be non-negotiable. But the steps, the ways, we just get people to move on that.
Thank you very much for those wise closing comments. You're right on time. It's just over midnight for you, Thomas. So we close the webinar now.
Thank you.
Questions are still coming. There is an email where people can address additional questions and comment. We'll be delighted to share with contributors. Thank you very much, everyone. I will close the discussion now, and we keep being connected all together on those fascinating topics.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.